Special episode, re-release of Episode 1, Introduction, and Episode 2, Peter, Prince of the Apostles. Thank you for listening to the History of the Papacy podcast. Since the audio quality of the introduction episode and Episode 2, St. Peter, Prince of the Apostles, wasn't quite up to standard, I thought I would re-release them in a better audio format. I would like to apologize again for the poor audio quality of those two episodes. I'll probably have a few more stumbles along the way with podcasting, but hopefully this one will be behind us. A new episode on the recent resignation of Pope Benedict XVI is in the works and will be out soon. Thank you again for listening and enjoy. Episode 1, Introduction. Welcome to the History of the Papacy podcast. My name is Steve, and thank you for listening to my first foray into podcasting. This is a podcast that will investigate and discuss the history of the popes of Rome. This first introductory episode will attempt to lay out my basic premise for the program. This podcast will not be theological or religious in nature. I will take a purely historical perspective to the history of the Roman papacy. That being said, I will necessarily be talking about Christianity, Jesus, saints, the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, Protestant churches, the Bible, and reference priests, bishops, deacons, and other church leaders. This is obviously unavoidable. Additionally, I have chosen to use the AD, Anno Domini, and BC before Christ to mark time. I have found that BCE, before the Common Era, and CE, Common Era, to be a bit confusing to follow, especially when listening. This podcast will not be a narrative that starts at Peter and continues to Benedict XVI or beyond. The plan is to have a multi-part series of several episodes that fall in a common era or time frame. A time frame in papal history might be as short as a few years or as long as centuries. This thematic approach seems to me an effective way to tie everything together and contextualize the rich history of the pontiffs of Rome as much as possible. These episodes will include background information for the series, biographical sketches of famous or influential popes of that time, context of major historical events that were happening at the same time, changes in the role of the Pope, and looks into institutions of the Church. I struggled with using this approach because, to me, the history of the Roman popes seems to lend itself pretty naturally with the great man top-down historical approach. All I would have to do is start with Peter or Linus, and then move chronologically through to Benedict XVI. The chronological narrative approach certainly could work and would be a really interesting podcast. But my goal for this podcast is to take detours down different paths in historical events, along with looking at biographies of popes. The detours, side trips, and back alleys of the papacy and of the Church are fascinating and deserve a closer look. The first several podcasts are going to focus on the early church history, starting with St. Peter. Early church history was often not very well documented. Some sources I will use may be somewhat apocryphal, legendary, or any of the number of other modifiers for 2,000-year-old documents. The next few episodes will detail the major ordained offices of the Church. These include presbyters or priests, deacons, and bishops. Bishops are going to be a major focus because the Pope is officially the Bishop of Rome. The Pope carries the title of Bishop of Rome along with the additional titles of His Holiness the Pope, Vicar of Jesus Christ, Successor to St. Peter, Prince of the Apostles, Supreme Pontiff of the Universal Church, Patriarch of the West, Servants of the Servant of God, Primate of Italy, the Archbishop and Metropolitan of the Roman Province, and Sovereign of the Vatican City-State. Each of these titles are completely packed full of history that reaches into nearly every facet of European and world history for the past 2,000-odd years, and I hope to delve into many of these aspects in some detail. Even the name of the Pope itself is of interest. Pope derives from the Greek or Latin word papa, which is a diminutive of the word for father, essentially dad. The Bishop of Rome is not alone in being known as Pope either. The Patriarch of Alexandria, either Greek or Coptic, is known as Pope. Currently, the Greek Orthodox Patriarch of Alexandria is Pope Theodorus II, and confusingly enough, the recently elected Coptic Pope of Alexandria is also named Theodorus II. But they are both called Pope as their title. They are both called Pope Theodorus II. The word Pope is simple, but carries a great deal of historical baggage. I'm excited to go on to this journey to find more. So why make a podcast about the popes of Rome? Why are they so important that people would want to listen to a history podcast about the Roman papacy? I think that there is an important topic because the popes are religious and political figures. In 2,000 years, their roles have changed significantly, but popes to this day still hold real temporal and religious power. When a pope travels to different countries, crowds of thousands, tens or even hundreds of thousands come to see him. People really care what he has to say on important issues of the day and follow his teachings, and people have been doing this for over 20 centuries. I can't honestly think of another office or person who has had such an everyday effect on people's lives for such a long period of time. Finally, to wrap up this introductory podcast, I also think an introduction is a good place to talk about my philosophy on podcasting and knowledge. This podcast is not exhaustive, and my knowledge and understanding of the topic is not all-encompassing by any stretch of the imagination. That is why I thoroughly enjoy the medium of podcasting. A person who puts out a podcast can get most of what they talk about right, but can also make mistakes. Most of the time they are small factual errors, but they can also be colossal errors. The beauty of the podcast is that there is an opportunity for nearly instantaneous correction. Most podcasts I listen to have made errors, and the host corrects them in the next episode or in some other media such as their blog, Facebook page, Twitter account, or whatever. I think that this is an incredible thing. Your college professor isn't going to correct himself if he makes a mistake. The newspaper buries corrections at the bottom of the page if they make a correction at all. Much of the so-called history programming on television today is utter garbage. Again, no correction or even attempts to clarify mistakes or misunderstandings. I feel I have to take this brief moment to put my philosophy out there and make known where I'm coming from. I hope you enjoy listening to this podcast as much as I have researching and making it. I think it will be an enjoyable and entertaining trip. If you want to discuss topics for future podcasts or debate the finer points of papal history, please find the podcast on Facebook at the History of the Papacy podcast page. I will put some pictures of famous popes, the Vatican, and update on news about the podcast. Thank you for listening, and I hope to hear from you. Next will be the first full episode of the History of the Papacy podcast. Episode 2, Peter, Prince of the Apostles. Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast. I'm Steve, your host for this podcast about the popes of Rome. In the introduction, I said that I wouldn't take the so-called great man approach or necessarily follow a narrative from the first pope to the current pope. That being said, I think the best way to start is by talking about the founder of the office of Roman Pope. That man is St. Peter, Prince of the Apostles. Peter played an enormous role in the early history of Christianity. He founded Christian communities all over the area of modern Israel, Lebanon, and Syria. He installed bishops to lead the communities he founded. Most importantly, he was essentially Jesus' right-hand man. Peter was the leader of the apostles, or main followers of Jesus. Peter was with Jesus in many of the most important scenes in the Bible. Eventually go to Rome and become the leader of the Christian community there, becoming the first bishop of Rome. Before we get started, one thing to keep in mind is that, as with just about everything else with the papacy, there is much debate about the reliability of the sources. The Bible is a major source, along with Origen, Eusebius, the Acts of the Apostles, and the Apocrypha of Peter, or Acts of Peter. Some of these sources aren't even agreed upon by Catholic scholars. I think in the end we have to accept that the sources are not going to be ironclad and that there will be a certain amount of bias in them. We'll start off with a brief look at Peter's early life, leading up to becoming involved with Jesus' ministry. After that, we can discuss how Peter became so important to early Christianity, and that will lead into the basis for the primacy of the Roman papacy. Then we can finally begin to discuss why the eventual successors to Peter can claim that they have a special and leading authority over all Christians. The foundation is laid right in the beginning with Peter. Let's start at the beginning with Peter's early life. Peter was said to be born in 4 BC at Bethsaida in the Galilee region. This would make Peter more or less the same age as Jesus. Bethsaida can be translated as the house or place of fishing, which makes sense because Peter was a fisherman by trade. The exact location of Bethsaida is not known, but research, especially that of the University of Nebraska, seems to indicate that it was located at the northern part of the Sea of Galilee, which is in the northeastern corner of Israel. It was probably near the border of modern-day Syria and Lebanon. Not a ton is known about his early life. He may have lived with a wife and his mother-in-law, and he is said to have had daughters. Peter's wife may have been martyred as well. His father was Jonas. Therefore, Peter was known as Simon Bar Jonas, Bar being the Hebrew for son of. Now, speaking of who is Simon, Simon, or Simeon, was Peter's original name. The name Peter came later when Jesus gives Simon that name. Peter is derived from the Greek word for rock or stone, Petra. If you think of the word petrified, meaning turned into stone, as in petrified trees, etc., in the Hebrew or Aramaic, it would have been Kephas. Let's not get ahead of ourselves here and back up a bit. Peter also had a brother, Andrew, who was one of the 12 apostles as well. Peter was not well educated, but this is not very shocking, given that he was a tradesman and born in a backwater area of Judea. The area of the country he was from was pretty far away geographically and culturally from Jerusalem and the other hot spots of the time. During the life and ministry of Jesus, Peter is basically right beside him during most of the key moments in the Bible. Peter is with Jesus when he is arrested, at the Last Supper, and the resurrection, to obviously name just a few of the instances. Since I don't intend this podcast to be a Bible study, and I want this to lead into the founding of the Bishopric of Rome, I will skip most of the details from the various Gospels. The major point is that Peter was without a doubt Jesus' right-hand man. How do we know that Peter was important to Jesus? Jesus gave Peter a special place among his 12 apostles, or his most important early followers, and that is why he is known as the Prince of the Apostles. Jesus' earliest and closest followers were known as the 12 apostles. In future podcasts, I will discuss the importance of the apostles and the apostolic traditions and succession. But here is a brief overview. There are many biblical reasons for the number 12 from the Old Testament and ancient traditions. The 12 original apostles were Peter, James, John, Andrew, Philip, Thomas, Bartholomew, Matthew, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, Judas, son of Jonas, and last but certainly not least by a long shot, Judas Iscariot. Once Judas Iscariot had his eventual falling out, Matthias was elected by the other apostles. All of these apostles or early disciples of Jesus have their own stories and spread to the furthest reaches of the Roman Empire and far, far beyond. Every bishop in the Roman Catholic, Eastern and Oriental Orthodox, and with certain qualifications that I won't even get close to getting into here, many of the Anglican communities can trace their ordination to one of the 12 apostles. Bishops will become very important. An entire episode will be devoted to them coming up. So more on bishops later. Just keep in mind that they exist and they are related to the apostles. This time period of the early first half of the 1st century AD was an incredibly unsettled time in the Eastern Mediterranean world. Rome had conquered vast amounts of land in the region around modern-day Israel, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and Syria. There were also numerous client kingdoms, such as that of Herod Agrippa and his successors. This is the time of Jesus and the early ministries of the apostles, including Peter. There were many sects of Judaism, all debating and arguing theology and how to deal with Hellenism and the encroachment of the Romans. The early Christians were part of a Jewish community that was in great upheaval. Big things were happening all over the place. The Romans were definitely not particularly happy the way things were going down in this area of their burgeoning empire. This is basically the scene that we find ourselves in during the early 1st century AD. The area of Judea was a powder keg of competing religious factions, establishment factions, reforming factions, local kingdoms, and princes, and the 800-pound gorilla in the room, the Roman Empire, all swirling around trying to get an upper hand in this dynamic corner of the world. While I stated previously that this is not a Bible study class, there are references all throughout the Bible in which the basis of the primacy or leadership of the popes of Rome in regards to the Christian community are based. One of the most important is founded in the Gospel of Matthew. I will quote one of the passages, and you can feel free to delve more deeply into the New Testament to find more really fascinating quotes. The first quote is from Matthew 16:16, which he states, "He," Jesus that is, "said to them, 'But who do you say I am?' Simon Peter answered and said, 'You are the Christ, the Son of the living God.' Jesus answered and said to him," Peter that is, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosened in heaven." This is really the center of it all. This is the quote that the entire Roman papacy and all that it entails is based on. Let's break down this passage a little bit. This is when Peter is the first person to identify that Jesus is the Messiah. That is a pretty big deal right there, and shows that Peter certainly had a major position. Then Jesus changes Simon Bar-Jonah's name to Peter and pronounces that he will build his church with Peter as a foundation. Peter will spread the word about Jesus. Jesus says that he will give Peter the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Much imagery of the popes in later centuries will show them holding the keys of Peter. The final part of the passage is about the binding and loosing of sins, and is the key part of the puzzle that will lay the foundation for the claims of the primacy of the Roman popes. The power to get rid of people's sins was given to the 12 apostles, and the apostles were able to pass this power to their successors, which will lead to the idea of the apostolic succession. All the pieces, the binding and loosing of sins, apostolic succession, and the special role of Peter in the church are now in place. Many of these ideas will evolve and refocus in future generations, but essentially, these few ideas are the first step to the future power and influence of the Roman popes. After the crucifixion of Jesus, Peter continued to preach and lead and found many communities of early Christians. Communities of Christians began to spread around the area of Judea and Roman Syria and beyond. Peter was arrested, but by a miracle, according to the Acts of the Apostles, was freed. It doesn't go into any more detail than that. Just freed. Peter appoints Paul as a new apostle, specifically to the Gentiles or non-Jewish pagans. The heat continues to increase on Peter in Jerusalem, so he heads out and becomes the first bishop of Antioch. Antioch is a pretty big deal. Antioch was easily the third largest city in the Roman Empire after Rome and Alexandria in Egypt. Antioch will go on to be one of the pentarchy, or 5 most important metropolitan sees of the Christian Church. The major urban centers would be Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, and Jerusalem. At this point in the story, Jerusalem had an episcopal see. Alexandria and Rome would come shortly after, and Constantinople wouldn't come until much later. At this earliest point, there was not a distinction between Christians and Jews. They were all on a continuum of the Jewish sects of the time. All the sects followed the Mosaic law with certain reservations. The Mosaic law, or the laws of Moses, are to this day the laws that many Jews follow and govern most aspects of their daily lives. 2 of the most commonly known laws concern circumcision and dietary laws known as the kashrut or kosher laws. There are over 300 other laws as well. Essentially, the early Christians were Jewish, but with the addition of Gentiles to the mix, this was all to change. All this is important to the story of Peter because Peter would participate in what would be the first church council in Jerusalem before he went to Rome. All the heavy hitters of the time attended the council. Interestingly, Peter was not the chair of the council, but instead Jesus' brother James, or James the Just, as he was known as, led the council. A future podcast will be devoted to this first council, but essentially it was decided that Gentile pagans could be full members of the Christian church without committing to the entirety of the Mosaic law. In my opinion, this is the time when Christianity and Judaism became 2 separate religions, not sects of the same religion. Jewish Christians would exist for a long time after this, but this was really the beginning of the change. The final part of Peter's journey was to go to Rome. Believe it or not, there is not a lot of detail of why he went to Rome or for how long he preached there. There are apocryphal sources and much later sources. There is intriguing archaeological evidence that says that Peter actually did go to Rome and was buried there. Excavations deep under St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican have found remains from this period of time wrapped in a purple burial shroud, which match very closely descriptions from this time. It is said that Peter became caught up in the persecutions that occurred under Nero. Nero blamed the burning of Rome on the early Christian sect. We could go down many roads with this one, and the dates are in dispute. One really interesting take on the persecutions of Nero is put out by Stephen Dando Collins in his book, The Great Fire of Rome. He essentially says that it was the cult of Isis that was being persecuted, not the Christians. It is very possible that Nero would scapegoat any group he could push the blame off of instead of himself for the fire. I'm willing to say that it is possible the Christians were not the main object of blame for the fire, but they certainly could have easily got caught up in it along with other outsiders. But essentially, all of the probable dates for Peter's death put it in the neighborhood of the Neronian persecutions. Some say he was martyred in 55 AD, others 64, and still others 67. There is evidence to support all these claims. 2 interesting stories come about around the death of Peter. One is that he wanted to be crucified upside down, as not to be crucified in the same way as Jesus. Another fascinating story is the story of Quo Vadis. This story relates to when Peter finds out that he is going to be crucified. He starts to head out of Rome in order to not be crucified. On his way down the road out of Rome, Peter sees Jesus walking the other way. Peter asks Jesus, Quo vadis, Domine? Or, where are you going, Lord? Jesus said that he was going back to Rome to be crucified again. After that, Peter turned around and was crucified. True or not, these are really fascinating stories and shed much light on early Christianity and the history of the church, especially in Rome. Peter really strikes me as a fascinating and human character. He got angry, he made mistakes, and he didn't always live up to his ideals. In the Bible and the various sources, you get a real feeling of who Peter was. This is probably a good time to wrap up this episode. There is much more to be said, but the basic building blocks are in place. We will continue to look at the very beginnings of church history and how the office of the Bishop of Rome will develop and evolve during this early period. Upcoming, I would also like to do an episode on the overview of the archaeology of finding Peter's tomb in the Vatican. Thank you again for joining me on this updated version of the episodes 1 and 2. If you have any questions or comments or want to discuss something further, check out the Facebook page, History of the Papacy Podcast. You can email me at historyofthepapacypodcast@gmail.com. Go to the website, History A to Z page at libsyn.com. That again is History A-T-O-Z page, libsyn.com. We're also now on Twitter at the Twitter call sign Papal History Pod. I would really love to hear your feedback. I hope to hear from you soon. And I'll see you the next time on our next stop on the tour of the history of the Popes of Rome.
Aus dem